Okay, so continuing on, we've explored informally, in what kinds of contexts information can be more or less sensitive. There's also some, somewhat more formal or, standards-based, even legal, increasingly some legal definitions of things like confidentiality levels. Methods, kind of standard processors for evaluating the sensitivity of information based on multiple factors. Now, these are all very general, broad guidelines. They can be, slippery and difficult to apply in particular cases, and it's not clear, not entirely clear necessarily how, maybe what you actually get from, from these categorizations, but they are often standard practices to be aware of and to keep in mind. So, for example, like I mentioned before, the U.S. NIST has standards regarding the definitions for PII and confidentiality impact levels. So they have categories based on impact level. Well, meaning, what does it mean? What's the perceived likely potential adverse effects if the information is released or disclosed to the wrong person? So low meaning limited adverse effect, moderate or high, severe or catastrophic adverse effects. But of course, that's only one of the dimensions that's relevant. Besides, kind of how bad it is when if there's an unauthorized disclosure. There's also factors such as, well, how identifying is the information. What is the quality? What is the quantity of it? How many records get leaked? Is it 25 or 25 million? And the sensitivity of each record. So, and here are some of the guidelines that you can find in these kinds of systems. So, limited adverse effect, cause a degradation, result in minor damages to organizational asset, minor financial loss, blah blah blah. Going all over to severe or catastrophic, major damages to organizational assets, major financial loss, things like that. So, of course, these definitions are pretty dry. They feel like what you would read in an insurance policy or something, and so, again, it's not that clear. That when your personally identifying information has been hacked and misused or something, it's not that clear that this particular categorization is going to make you feel better, especially if you were, your information that was leaked was formally placed in the low or moderate category, but it really does matter to you, right? But at any rate, some of these practices for classifying PII risks are becoming moderately standard in companies and in law circles. So it's just useful to be aware of them. So, and then again, some of the factors, some of the semi-orthogonal factors, the identifiability of the information. Like direct identifiability, like social security numbers, or is information only potentially indirectly identifiable, such as location information or things like that. Quantity of PII, number of records, the sensitivity, and context of use. What is and this actually often figures in very closely in laws surrounding the use of personally identified information. What did the company collect it for? Why are you storing it? What is the process for determining what it can be used for in the future? So these are often very important considerations for companies and complying with laws like the GDPR, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Back to, we talked about the de-anonymization of the Netflix data set. Here's another example of a de-anonymization incident that illustrates the sensitivity of different individually not that sensitive information that kind of makes this categorization often hard to apply. So back in, what was the year, 2009? This article was from 2009, but the incident was even earlier. The Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission released supposedly anonymized data on state employees showing basically every single hospital visit over a period of time. And this was, a great thing for researchers. They removed obvious identifiers such as name, address, and social security number. But there was an enterprising graduate student, and when enterprising graduate students get their hands on data sets like this, anything can happen. And so basically, LaTanya Sweeney, who's a well-known professor in privacy now, basically took that data set and started looking at it. And she decided to, okay, well, the governor of Massachusetts is one of the civil servants that must be in this data set somewhere. Can't tell, it's anonymized, who he is, but she decided, well, let's see if we can find the governor. And she knew that the governor resided in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has 54,000 residents and 7 zip codes. She purchased the voter rolls from the city of Cambridge, which is public information. And that database contains the name, address, zip code, birth date, and sex of each voter. By combining these data sets, she basically narrowed that down immediately to 6 people. Only 6 people in Cambridge had the same birth date. Only 3 of them were men, and only the governor only one lived in the governor's zip code, right? Known zip code. So she identified, okay, here's the governor's health records, and sent them to the governor's office. And naturally, this caused a little bit of a stir. And so again, that while being able to categorize and try to think about the identifiability and sensitivity of information, is important. It's important to factor in experiences like this, where these correlations can be used to change the sensitivity. Yeah.
So couldn't the governor have been localized only based on the zip code, because you said
no. So 6 people. Well, many people lived in his zip code, but she apparently narrowed down first by birth date. Narrows it down a lot. That was the biggest narrowing, which narrowed it down to 6 people. Apparently, in that 6 people total in the data set. And then sex cut out half of the remaining results, and then finally the zip code cut out the last 2. But so there were 7 possible zip codes present in this data set, right? So this was a data set for a local area. So kind of knowing the data set in the zip code in this case didn't tell a lot of information, but it cuts it down by like a factor of 7, right? So sex gender divides the possibilities in 2, zip code divides the possibility in 7 in this case, because there were 7 zip codes. Birth date, divides it into, 365, right? So, you combine those multiple factors that are relatively independent of each other, boom, 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 you're very quickly down to 1. That's the whole point. Yeah. So, and kind of these things have happened repeatedly, and so in many different areas. Okay. So let's look. So now that you're well aware, some of the many things that can go wrong, that can make information more sensitive than it seems on the surface. Let's look at some of the concepts and processes that are often used to in trying to figure out, well, how can we manage data more safely, in company environments when you have to manage sensitive data for whatever reason, when you think you have a legitimate need, or a company thinks they have a legitimate need to collect and manage sensitive information. Here are some of the practices that are becoming kind of standard expected practice. So first of all, there are 3 main phases. Pre-collection, what you do to prepare before you've even, before you collect the first bit of sensitive data for some purpose, you do a pre-collection phase to decide exactly what you're collecting, why, and how you're going to manage it, kind of the planning phase. And then the operational phase, how once you are collecting it, how do you maintain it securely while you're operating, and then, if God forbid, and many companies are increasingly moving into the not if but when it's compromised, just increasingly just assuming a breach will happen of some kind at some point. Let's try to, how do we minimize the damage when that happens? Well, you have to have an incident response plan. Some, kind of, if, more likely, when something bad happens, what do we do? We hear about, get that very unwelcome call from the reporters who have heard that this hacker, found some interesting data set on your company on this unsecured FTP server or something like that. And do you have any comment? How do you comment if you're, the representative of the company that is the first person to hear about this? Well, I guarantee you want a plan. You want to be able to say, well, we'll have to look at this. We have a incident response. We're looking at this, and we'll have some information soon, right? Okay. So let's look at these phases anyway. So pre-collection, before starting collect the data. In the design, when it's important to identify what information is needed. Why do you need it? And I mean, that's really the most important, and that in part determines what information you need, right? And how it's intended to be used. Of course, who will it be shared with? Anyone? Who will it be shared with? What other companies? Under what conditions? And how the information will be secured in terms of storage and use. Right. Now, this is an area where it's become standard practice for companies that are taking responsible practices for information to have these kinds of processes, but it's also increasingly becoming law that companies beyond a certain size have to do this by law, and the laws vary around the world. We'll get into that a little bit. But one of the big developments all around us in the EU is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that's coming into effect this May, if I recall. So the time is ticking, and a lot of companies in Europe are very worried about whether they're compliant, what do they need to do to become compliant, what happens if they're found to be not compliant. And that last part, is, we can answer very, very quickly. It's the GDPR is specifying some pretty substantial sanctions, wielding a pretty heavy stick. Sanctions of up to 20 million euros or up to 4% of the annual worldwide turnover, the income, income and expenses, whichever is greater. And so that's a fairly substantial. That fine can hurt, let's say. And so a lot of companies are taking that more and more seriously and hiring data protection officers in part to try to figure out, well, what processes do we need to make sure we have in place for collection of sensitive data and management. So this isn't by any means an exhaustive example, but just kind of an example of what the type of analysis that this planning process might look at. So let's say we want to build or use a chat application now, or authorize the use of a chat application by employees or provide it to customers. And the chat application would like to gather certain types of information for various reasons, such as full name, telephone number, birthday, contacts, credit card. So for each of those categories of information, it's important to identify these rows. Why do we want that information, right? Well, we want the full name for greeting contacts, identifying contacts. Chat applications often want a telephone number to verify that a real user, to verify that they're not a fake account or a single user creating many accounts. Birthday to verify offers or to make sure you don't try to sell alcohol to someone who's underage or something like that. So all kinds of things like that you have to consider. So, and then the next step would typically be to look at that matrix and evaluate the privacy impact of each of these pieces of information. Now, of course, to reiterate, all of this is often very subjective, and it can be difficult to, categorize these into low, medium, high levels. But it's often it's at least necessary to think about that. What information. Which of these pieces of information might be most sensitive, might be most harmful if they're leaked or used the wrong way. For example, if the chat application has the ability to write to all contacts, and many applications, when they say ask you to log in with Facebook or kind of connect to other services, they often ask permissions. They want to ask you permissions to send messages to contacts or stuff like that, because they want to provide some kind of services. But some of those permissions might really be more harmful or sensitive to others. And then you have to if you're taking a responsible approach to this, you might look at some of the more potentially privacy-sensitive cells in that matrix and ask, well, do we really need that information? How important is that particular use of this information? Is it really worth the risk, or is the risk enough that maybe it would be better if we ask, ask the user if he wants this particular functionality, rather than just assuming that all users do. Have an opt-in process for the cases where we perceive a higher potential sensitivity, or even explicitly restrict default uses and sharing patterns, for example, to friends, or make sure that some things are not shared at all normally. And then we have to, of course, look at, well, how are these pieces of data actually secured and stored securely? What practices can we use to minimize the harm if something bad happens? So if we decide we need to store telephone numbers at all, well, maybe we don't need the clear text telephone number. In that case, if we only need it for verification purposes to ensure that a user isn't creating 10,000 fake accounts using the same phone number, well, then we don't actually need to store the telephone number. It's kind of like in the password scenario. We just need to be able to tell if the user tries to verify another 2 or 3 or 1,000 accounts using the same phone number. We just need to be able to tell that, right? So then we can use the same techniques that we talked about earlier, like salted password hashes, possibly more advanced password hashing functions that are memory hard and take a long time, kind of put them through that kind of, password hash function and only store this salted password hash of the telephone number in the database, which will hopefully ensure that, even if that database is leaked, it'll be hard, at least not impossible, but hard for the attacker to work back to find the actual telephone number, right? So definitely not a perfect solution, but these kinds of measures can improve. Similarly, if you decide that the chat app wants the birthday, but mainly only so that it can send birthday greetings, then maybe it doesn't need to know which year you were born, right? Maybe it's okay if it just knows which month and day. Of course, that's still sensitive. It still can be sensitive because other services might use your birthday as secret information as part of a password reset process. So none of this information is non-sensitive, but at least it's a little less sensitive if you decide you can delete the year and only keep the month and day, right? And then, you can do other things like, if this particular server doesn't actually need to store it, but it can just live on the client's application, or it can live somewhere else where it's just not vulnerable to disclosure if the server's database is hacked, right? So there's often a lot of options to at least reduce the sensitivity and the potential impact if something goes wrong, and it's always worth exploring those, even if, granted, there are no perfect solutions at the moment when we're dealing with sensitive data. Okay. Questions? Yeah. So we've talked about encryption before, of course, and we'll talk about encryption a lot more in this class. So this, so I'm not going to get a lot more into this right now, but just reiterate that, any place sensitive personal data is stored, it's important to think about, well, what kind of encryption at rest are we using? If the answer is none, then we're not doing our job. Right? So, and this could be disk encryption or database level encryption, or various measures can be useful in different situations, but we have to think about that. And then, despite even though I just spent the first half of the lecture telling you why anonymization doesn't work, nevertheless, anonymization, is still can still be a valid incremental protective measure, right? So if your database doesn't need to have the actual, kind of the full granularity of data, the full names or the exact age, maybe the data set only needs to know whether you're over 18 or not, or in a particular age threshold, in order to know if you have the right to something, you have the consent to the right, you're a minor or not. Then you can reduce the granularity and specificity of the data. You can deliberately reduce the fidelity and accuracy of data by introducing noise into it. So this will be a topic using differential privacy, for example. And this is a technique we'll get into more later. You can also merge data, store only aggregates of classes of users rather than individual users. So all of these are individually techniques that are none of which are perfect solutions individually, but together they can improve the robustness and reduce damage if the data is disclosed. So differential privacy has become kind of a hot topic in the past few years, and this is a good place to look at some of the ways this is being used. We're not going to get deeply into the theory now, but just to illustrate, one way this is being used by both Apple and Google is to gather aggregate statistics over many users and asking questions. For example, if you ask a user a sensitive question, did you ever break the law? Or pick another potentially sensitive question. Actually, most of these are asking, automated questions. Do you run this app or not? Do you, have this behavior pattern or not? Which, Apple would like to know, but they don't really know whether any particular person, uses this app or not, or exhibits this behavior or not. They want to find out, do 0% or 10% or 90% or 100% of their users exhibit this pattern, or do this thing. And so just kind of the idea is, well, here's a basic procedure. If you ask the user a sensitive question like, did you ever break the law? And the user doesn't just answer. Instead, the user follows this flowchart. The user first tosses a fair coin. If it comes up tails, the user tells the truth about whether they broke the law or not. If the coin comes up heads, then we toss the coin again, and we use the result of that coin to decide whether we say yes or no. So we're going to lie in this case, and we lie either yes or no randomly, right? So we're deliberately, so some users will be telling the truth. Statistically, about half of the users will be telling the truth to these answers, and the other half will be lying in a completely random way. That's the idea, anyway. And in principle, Apple shouldn't know which user is telling the truth and which is lying. Now, of course, this introduces a lot of noise. In fact, it's half noise, right? Does that make the data set completely useless? How do you use the result of, who knows your statistics to figure out, how you use the result of this data set? Yeah? Yeah.
Just like, making average and then just, so probably that's not for like frequent specific user, right?
Exactly.
But we're saying that that percentage of people actually broke the law, right?
Yep.
So we actually take like a 75% increase of this result, and then we say like that many people just broke the law.
Yeah. So basically, if you aggregate many data points, even though it's half noise, you actually, across many data points, you can cancel out the noise. You can basically average out all of the noise, and with high probability, get a very, very good estimate over many data points of of the exact number. So you have to do a little adjustment because you know, kind of in practice, even if 100% of the people are reporting, you know, who actually answer are reporting, yes, I broke the law, you won't see that as 100% heads. You'll see that as 75%, or, you know, saying I broke the law. And so you do the little adjustment based on that, the expectation of you know, of the noise to cancel out the noise, but it's a pretty simple calculation, and you get a, you know, kind of a strong aggregate picture of people's answer without learning any reliable information about any particular person, right? And in some sense, this is information theoretically secure. If you look at, you know, kind of what's happening here and look at the stream ciphers that we were talking about earlier in this class, there's a very close relationship. So if you don't know, you know, any other information about a particular person's true answer, then this, you know, basically amounts to encrypting the answers with an unknown stream cipher, which makes it impossible in general to learn what's going on about any particular person. Again, you know, given those caveats. Okay, so this is a, you know, powerful and interesting, useful in some cases technique, and there's a lot of fairly sophisticated theory that's developed in the research community around it. Differential privacy has been a fairly hot research topic. It also has a lot of limitations. You know, if it's used the wrong way, it can still leak information. If it's used too much, it can leak information over if you query a single data set repeatedly, or if you commit the sin of using the same coins. Just like, remember, we were talking about the stream ciphers. You know, they become completely broken if you ever reuse the same seed. Well, if you use predictable coins or the same coins over again, then this privacy completely falls apart too, for exactly the same reasons. So there's important limitations to be aware of, and we'll get into that later in the course. But just to introduce you to those type of techniques. So continuing the general, you know, exploring how do you plan for so we were talking about planning for data collection. Now we look at the operating phase. What do you do with the data while you're operating? With whom do you allow the data to be exchanged or shared? What data do you need to exchange? What subset of the data do particular third parties need access to, and why, right? And so, you know, different companies are going to have different answers to this in different scenarios. And of course, always, you know, think about what could go wrong if the data is leaked. And, you know, Facebook has gotten in trouble. You know, many tech companies have gotten in trouble for this kind of things repeatedly. You know, of course, Facebook is now in the news yet again in the Cambridge Analytics incident. But back a few years ago, they were in the news for having accidentally leaking. I can't remember. Let's see. Yeah, I can't remember exactly which user data was being leaked in this particular incident, but you know, it was either non-obvious how the privacy settings were working, or the privacy settings were buggy, so it was leaking things that the users hadn't given them permission to leak, and this wasn't even detected for you know, a factor of years. Yeah. So that's the operating phase, and then finally the incident response phase. You know, you have to have a process before the incident happens as to how you deal with it. So how does it get reported? Who's in charge of the incident response? How can you prepare for the response what forensic processes are you going to rely on? Are there backups available so that you can tell what data was tampered with and might have been tampered with by an attacker? What might you compare against for forensic purposes? Things like that. Now, so I haven't talked a lot about backups so far. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll just quickly touch on that. So when something goes wrong, forensics, logging and backups are really critical. Being able to tell what happened, at what time things went wrong, being able to pinpoint when the attacker got in and start compromising, ideally figure out what they might have gotten, what they might have stolen. That tends to be very hard in general. But having logs, lots of logs, generally helps, and backups of those logs in a place that it's, because like I mentioned earlier, a hacker who knows what they're doing, the first thing they're going to do once they get in is try to tamper with the logs to cover their tracks, to eliminate the evidence. And if there are backups stored securely elsewhere that they can't tamper with, that's very important to be as a recovery measure, to be able to tell what they actually did. What did they erase in the non-backup logs by comparing it against the backup logs, right? So, yeah, and so this is one of the many fun issues, difficult issues that inspired XKCD cartoons about overly complex backup processes. And backup processes can be a huge pain. In reality, it's also, besides just making sure they work, it's also making sure they're happening. It's also often difficult to verify that the backups are actually getting stored properly. Will they really be there when you need them, or will you discover that for some stupid bug reason all of the backups for the last 5 years were corrupted, and only now when the incident happened do we discover that we don't have any backups of any usable backups of what went on in the last 5 years. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, and so now, of course, if and when an incident happens, you have to, the process has to contain the incident, kind of identify, what set of systems did it or might it have effective. Can we remove the most sensitive data as quickly as possible, and how do you eliminate the attacker's presence? If the attacker has gotten malware into a set of systems, do you just reinstall them, or do you fully replace the hardware? Right. So just reinstalling them, the operating system will work fine for some types of attacks, but attackers who really know what they're doing might install a rootkit, a virtual machine-based rootkit, or a BIOS rootkit that persists even a reinstall of the operating system. So these things exist. So some companies that are particularly paranoid, if an incident occurs, all the potentially affected machines go straight to the technology recyclers and get brand new ones. And because otherwise, how can you be sure that that you really got all of the got the attacker out? Right? And so that's another big topic and big challenge. Okay, so let's. So I mentioned the RUAG incident before here in Switzerland, where this major defense related company was successfully hacked for a number of months back in 2016 before successfully being detected. And eventually they found out that the attacker was exfiltrating data, quite a bit of, significant amounts of data over quite a period of time. And this is a plot of, when those data exfiltrations occurred. And they only figured this out because they had adequate logs and forensics capabilities that they could rely on to figure that out later. Now, as far as I know, they still, I don't know if they ever positively identified who was behind the attack, and that's often difficult because sophisticated attackers often use multi-tier sets of proxies to actually exfiltrate the data. So the attackers' personal systems are never going to talk to the RUAG or the victim's machines directly, but instead they use a Tor-like onion network, but built on the attacker's malware-infected infrastructure to make it so the tier 1 proxies are the only sets of machines that are directly connected to the victim's network and exfiltrating data. And so the defenders would have to literally reverse hack, break into that first tier in order to find who the next second tier nodes are, and so on. And often spy agencies like the NSA, might well do that, but most companies have neither the capability nor the legal mandate to do that. Hacking back is whether and under what circumstances a private party or a company might have the right to hack back is a very, very open, controversial issue, and it's generally not accepted as lawfully acceptable to do that. Okay, so let's take so that's some general concepts for managing and reducing, preparing and reducing the risk and managing for incident response. Let's take another look at slightly closer look at the applicable laws. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice or anything, and this is a super high-level sketch of a very deep, complex topic. You could take, whole courses on this thing, I'm sure, and I'm sure people in law school do. So let's just take a quick look at Switzerland, Europe, and the U.S. So Switzerland has a number of privacy laws, such as the Federal Act on Data Protection, which applies to personal data. And I won't get into detail, but it defines things like what kinds of acts on data are regulated, collection, storage, use, revision, disclosure, definitions, and regulations around these, and jurisdictional scope. Who determines what is it federal laws, cantonal laws, who has charge of the data, and who pays if something goes wrong. Right? There's also other privacy-related laws, such as Freedom of Information Act, that says that basically promote transparency, that say that if you're a federal worker, then a citizen can demand that you release relevant emails or other information pertaining to something that's of the public interest. So in a sense, these are anti-privacy provisions when it comes to civil servants, and all of us professors at EPFL are civil servants. So we can potentially be affected by these kinds of laws, and so a large class of people can potentially be, and so this adds a tricky little factor, right? So So let's take a look at the EU. Unfortunately, I don't have time for the fun video, but I encourage you to, look it up. You can find the slides online. If just go to slide 61 if you want an amusing video that the EU tried to, I believe, put out to warn people that the GDPR is coming. So just to wrap up, so the GDPR defines a much stronger set of privacy regulations, including important provisions, privacy design provisions. Many things are. It requires to be many uses of data. It requires to be opt-in rather than opt-out. It sets reporting requirements like data breaches must be reported within 72 hours. It has provisions like right to be forgotten. Users can demand that their data be deleted. And it requires companies of a certain size to have dedicated data protection officers that are responsible for ensuring this compliance. So this is a big thing. EU has other important, and a lot of this is still being sorted out. We won't get into all the details. And I'll skip over the details of the U.S. privacy laws, but the general picture is the U.S. privacy law situation is much more fragmented along types of data. So the U.S. doesn't have a single privacy law that applies to all types of data, but they have certain laws that applies to financial data, certain laws that apply to health and other things, and only weak privacy laws that kind of apply to everything. So you in the US you have to know what type of data you're dealing with to know what laws apply. And so it's in the health situation, the laws are much stronger, and they have this reporting requirement, these reporting processes. In other sectors in the U.S., you don't have that. You have much weaker laws. So, and of course, you have freedom of information attacks there too. So, without getting into more details, plenty of fun, interesting, useful links. But I'll leave it at that since we're out of time. So, in general, watch out. Be aware of the practices, standards, practices, and to the extent you can, the laws regarding personal sensitive information whenever you have to deal with it. Okay, thank you, and see you next time.